She pointed at him across the ballroom and laughed. He was wearing a suit that was 10 years out of style, standing alone near the shrimp cocktail table, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be there. Vivian Ashcroft, 34 years old, worth $11 billion, and thoroughly bored, made a joke to her publicist about inviting the lost-looking man over just to watch the room react. It was supposed to be cruel. It was supposed to last 5 minutes. Instead, 4 hours later, when her security team tried to signal that the event was ending, Vivian waved them off. She wasn't ready to stop talking to him. She didn't understand why. And that terrified her more than anything else that happened that night, which, before it was over, would include a threat on her life. If this is the kind of story that gets under your skin, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. We release new stories every week that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that ballroom. Let's start from the beginning. The Hartwell Grand wasn't the kind of place that welcomed mistakes. Everything about it had been engineered to remind people of exactly where they stood. The 40-foot ceilings hung with crystal chandeliers that cost more per fixture than most Americans earned in a year. The waitstaff who moved through the crowd with the silent precision of people who had been trained never to make eye contact unless directly addressed. The floral arrangements imported from the Netherlands specifically for this one evening and then discarded the following morning. The New York Children's Medical Foundation Gala was the city's most exclusive charitable event, which meant it had almost nothing to do with charity and almost everything to do with who could afford to be seen attending. Vivian Ashcroft had attended every year for the past 6 years. She'd written the check that kept the foundation's pediatric oncology wing operational for the next 3 years. She would not remember the name of a single person she spoke to tonight by the time her car reached her apartment. She stood near the east window with a glass of Sancerre she hadn't touched, listening to Douglas Merritt from Merritt Capital explain his thoughts on emerging markets in Southeast Asia. Douglas was 61 years old and had been explaining his thoughts on emerging markets since before Vivian had graduated college. She smiled at the appropriate intervals. She had learned early that men like Douglas didn't actually want a conversation. They wanted an audience that smiled and didn't interrupt. "You really should consider restructuring your exposure in that sector," Douglas was saying. Given the regulatory environment, Douglas, her publicist, Claire, appeared at her elbow with the particular expression that meant someone required Vivian's attention immediately. "I'm so sorry to interrupt. Vivian, there's something you need to see." Vivian excused herself with practiced grace and followed Claire 3 steps away, close enough that Douglas could still observe them, but not close enough to hear. "What?" Vivian said quietly. Claire tilted her head toward the far side of the room. "Who invited that?" Vivian looked. Near the appetizer display stood a man who did not belong here, and the room had already noticed. He was tall, maybe 6'1", broad through the shoulders in the way that suggested actual physical work rather than a personal trainer, with dark hair that had been recently but imperfectly cut, like he'd done it himself or let someone who loved him do it. His suit was navy blue and clearly expensive at some point, but that point had been approximately a decade ago. The lapels were wrong for the current year. The fit through the chest was slightly off in the way that happens when a man's body has changed, and he hasn't bought new clothes to account for it. His shoes were clean but not polished. He was standing with a small plate of food he hadn't eaten, looking at a painting on the wall near the window with the focused expression of someone who was actually thinking about it rather than pretending to. "I have no idea," Vivian said. "He came in with the Harrington Foundation Group," Claire said. "One of their board members apparently extended a blanket invitation to their staff. Someone didn't screen the list properly." "What does he do?" Claire checked her phone. "Maintenance supervisor, St. Catherine's Hospital." A pause. "He used to be an architect, apparently, some years ago." Vivian looked at him again. Someone on the other side of the room, she couldn't see who, said something, and a small cluster of people nearby laughed. The man at the painting didn't react. Either he hadn't heard or he understood exactly what was happening and had decided it wasn't worth his attention. She wasn't sure which possibility interested her more. "He looks completely out of place," Claire said, and there was something in her voice, not cruelty exactly, but the particular city dweller's instinct to categorize quickly and move on. Vivian took a sip of her wine. So do I most nights. I just have better costume. Claire looked at her. What does that mean? Nothing. Vivian set the glass down on a passing waiter's tray. I'm going to go talk to him. Vivian, it's a charity gala, Claire. I'm being charitable. She crossed the room at the pace of someone who had somewhere specific to be, which discouraged interception. Two people tried to stop her. One was a city councilman she genuinely liked and would call tomorrow. One was a technology journalist she actively avoided, and she navigated past both of them without breaking stride. The man was still looking at the painting when she stopped beside him. It was a landscape, Hudson River School, probably 1870s, a wide valley at late afternoon with the light going golden and heavy over distant mountains. Not the most prestigious piece in the room, not the one the foundation had promoted in the program, just a painting on a wall that most people had walked past without glancing at. The perspective is wrong, Vivian said. He turned. Up close, he looked tired in the specific way that wasn't about sleep, the tiredness that accumulates and doesn't leave when you rest. His eyes were gray, or maybe a dark blue that read as gray in this light, and they assessed her without the particular expression she usually got from men at these events, which was a combination of calculation and performance. He just looked at her like she was a person who had said something and he was deciding what he thought about it. What do you mean? He said. The valley floor. The artist painted it as if he was standing at roughly the same elevation as the mountains, but if you look at the angle of the light, he should be looking slightly upward. The horizon line is too high. It's subtle. Most people wouldn't notice, but it means the whole thing is spatially incorrect. He looked back at the painting, looked for a long moment. You're right, he said, then, but it doesn't matter. Why not? Because it still feels true. You look at it, and you feel like you're in that valley, at that hour, in that light. The math is wrong, but the experience is right. He paused. A technically perfect painting that doesn't make you feel anything is just a photograph. Vivian studied the painting again. Then she looked at him. You're Grant Holloway. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like mild resignation. You know who I am. My publicist identified you 30 seconds after I noticed you. This is Manhattan. Everyone gets identified. She extended her hand. Vivian Ashcroft. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief, no theater to it. I know who you are. Of course you do. She glanced toward the center of the room, where the cluster of people who'd laughed earlier had moved on to other conversations. Has tonight been unbearable? Grant considered the question seriously, which she hadn't expected. Not unbearable. Uncomfortable. There's a difference. He looked down at his plate, which held a small triangle of smoked salmon on toast that he'd been carrying for probably 20 minutes without eating. I shouldn't have come. I knew that when I got dressed. I came anyway because… He stopped. Because? He seemed to decide something. Because my daughter asked me what the inside of a fancy party looked like, and I didn't have an answer, and I thought maybe I should have one. He set the plate down on a side table. She's 6. She thinks everything I do is interesting, which means I have to occasionally do something that actually is. Vivian didn't say anything immediately. Around them, the gala continued its orchestrated performance. The clink of glasses, the orchestral quartet in the corner producing tasteful ambient sound, the rising and falling murmur of several hundred carefully managed social interactions. That's the most honest reason anyone has given me for attending one of these things, she said. Most people come because they're afraid not to. Why do you come? Because I'm afraid not to, she said. Same reason, different stakes. Something in his expression changed, not dramatically, just a small recalibration, like a door that had been slightly ajar opening another inch. What's your daughter's name? I don't have children. Okay. He glanced around the room. Then what do you go home to? It was not a rude question. It was asked with the directness of someone who didn't have the time or the inclination to dress questions in social wrapping paper, and it landed somewhere in her chest with a precision she wasn't prepared for. My apartment, she said, 12 floors above Central Park. It's very quiet. He nodded slowly. My apartment is never quiet. Maisie has decided that silence is suspicious. If it's quiet, she's doing something she shouldn't be. Maisie. That's her name? Margaret officially. She goes by Maisie. She would tell you herself, but she has very strong opinions about bedtimes, and I wasn't willing to negotiate tonight. A flicker of something. Not quite a smile, but close to one. She's the main reason I wore this suit instead of buying a new one. Kids are expensive. Across the room, she saw Richard Calloway, one of her senior vice presidents, a man she trusted as much as she trusted anyone in her professional life, which was to say conditionally and with ongoing verification, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not surprise, exactly. Something more considered than that. She filed it away. She was good at filing things away. What did you build? She asked Grant. When you were an architect. He was quiet for a moment, not evasively, thoughtfully, the way people are when a question requires them to visit somewhere they don't go often. Mixed-use residential mostly, some cultural buildings, one community library in Queens that I'm still proud of. The light in the reading room comes in from the north, which means it's consistent all day. No glare. You can actually read without squinting. He paused. A hospital wing, which is how I know the hospital where I now fix the HVAC systems, which is its own particular kind of full circle. Why did you stop? He looked at her steadily. My wife died 4 years ago. Maisie was 2. He said it plainly, without the performative grief or the aggressive stoicism that people usually deployed when sharing something this significant with a stranger. He said it the way you say a fact that has become integrated into your entire existence, something so fundamental that softening it would be inaccurate. She had a brain aneurysm. She was 31 years old, and she was completely healthy, and then she wasn't. I had a 2-year-old and no family in the city, and a job that required 60, 70 hours a week minimum. Something had to give. So you gave up architecture. I gave up the version of architecture that existed back then. Maybe I'll find another version eventually. He shrugged with one shoulder. Right now, Maisie needs consistency more than I need a career. Vivian thought about this. She was 34 years old, and she had built a technology company from a seed round of $2 million into an $11 billion enterprise, and she had never once made a decision that required her to choose between ambition and someone who needed her. She didn't know if that was a testament to her drive or an indictment of something she preferred not to examine directly. That's a significant sacrifice, she said. It's a choice, Grant said. There's a difference. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the ambient noise of the room with the particular carrying quality of someone who had never learned, or never needed, to modulate their volume in consideration of others. Vivian, Jeffrey Brent. Real estate. Third-generation family money and the personality that tends to accompany it. He materialized at her side with a crystal tumbler in one hand and the other hand extended toward Grant with the expression of a man who has spotted something curious but not particularly valuable. Who's your friend? Grant Holloway, Vivian said. Jeffrey's eyes moved over Grant's suit, his shoes, his plate of uneaten appetizer. Holloway, are you in finance? No, Grant said. Tech? Because if you're looking for, I supervise maintenance operations at St. Catherine's Hospital. The pause that followed was brief but complete. Jeffrey's hand, mid-extension, completed the shake with slightly reduced enthusiasm. Ah, good. Important work. He turned back to Vivian with the expression of a man who had processed this information and filed it appropriately. Vivian, I need to steal you for 5 minutes. Franklin Tate is here, and he specifically wanted to— Tell Franklin I'll find him in a bit, Vivian said. Jeffrey blinked. He's right over— In a bit, Jeffrey. Another pause. Jeffrey looked between them. A decision was reached. Of course. He retreated with the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to retreating gracefully. Grant watched him go. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to, Vivian said. Franklin Tate bores me profoundly, and Jeffrey Brant exists in a state of terminal self-importance. I find you considerably more interesting than either of them. Because I'm a novelty. Maybe. She was honest about this. Does that bother you? He considered. A little, but you're still here, so. He looked around the room again, then back at her. Can I ask you something? Yes? Do you actually enjoy any of this? She looked out at the room, the crystal and the catered food, and the careful management of relationships, and the performance of generosity, and the exhausting maintenance of a public self that bore only passing resemblance to the private one. No, she said. Not really. Not in years. Then why? Because this is what success looks like from the outside, she said. And I spent a long time building something I wanted the outside to be able to see. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, it wasn't what she expected. The library in Queens, he said, the one with the north-facing windows. When I was designing it, someone on the committee told me I should put the windows on the south side because it would look more impressive from the street, more dramatic, better for the photographs. He paused. I didn't. Because the people who would actually use that library, the people who would sit in those chairs and read those books for hours, they needed good light. Not impressive light, good light. Vivian looked at him. What's your point? I don't know exactly, he said. I think you do, though. She did. She didn't say so, Shad. They ended up at a small table near the east wall. Not at the main event seating, just two chairs that someone had positioned beside a decorative column, probably for guests who needed a moment's break from the main floor. Vivian had not intended to sit down. She sat down. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the things people talk about at these events, not about markets or acquisitions or social maneuvering, or the particular anxiety of maintaining relevance in an industry that discards people like seasonal produce. They talked about Maisie's current obsession with marine biology, specifically giant squid, which she was convinced were more intelligent than anyone gave them credit for. They talked about the particular challenge of reading bedtime stories to a child who had already read ahead and kept correcting the character motivations. They talked about what it felt like to walk into a building you designed and watch strangers use it without knowing you made it. They talked about what it felt like to walk into a boardroom full of people who respected you completely and feel absolutely alone. Grant was not what Vivian had expected. He was not trying to impress her. He was not networking. He was not positioning himself for anything. He was simply present, saying what he actually thought, asking what he actually wanted to know, not performing a version of himself calibrated to her approximate net worth. She found it disorienting. She also found it necessary in a way she couldn't articulate. At some point, she noticed Richard Calloway watching her again from across the room. This time, she couldn't pretend she hadn't registered it. His expression was too focused, and when their eyes met, he looked away too quickly. She made a note of this, filed it, returned her attention to Grant, who was saying something about the structural logic of hospital corridors, and how if you understood the way people moved through a building under stress, you could predict almost everything about where problems would occur. People under stress move in straight lines, he said. They don't look for clever solutions. They go toward the nearest recognizable landmark and stop there. That's why bad hospital design kills people, not dramatically but incrementally over time, through delay and confusion and wrong turns at the worst possible moments. You think about the way people move through spaces, she said. It's what I did for 10 years. You don't turn it off. What do you see when you walk into my kind of spaces? These events? These buildings? He looked around the room thoughtfully. I see a space designed to make you feel small unless you already belong. The ceiling height is calibrated to intimidate. The lighting is set to flatter people with a certain skin tone and a certain kind of clothing. The flow is arranged so that the people who control access to the important rooms are never visible until you already know where to find them. A pause. It's beautiful technically, and it's a very effective machine for what it's designed to do. Which is? Sort people, he said simply. Figure out, within about 90 seconds of someone walking in, whether they belong or they don't. And you don't belong. He met her eyes without apology. According to the machine, no, but the machine doesn't know what it doesn't know. She thought about that for a long time after she said goodnight to him in the marble lobby and watched him pull out his phone to check on his daughter's babysitter before he'd even reached the door. He typed quickly, then smiled at whatever the response was, a private smile, not for anyone else, just for himself and the message on the screen. She thought about it in the car on the way home. 12 floors above Central Park, in the apartment that was very quiet, she stood at the window and thought about it for a long time. It was past midnight. Her phone lit up with 17 messages she hadn't answered. She looked at them without opening any of them. Then, at 12:34 a.m., a notification from her company's internal security monitoring system, a system she checked in frequently and was admittedly not fluent in, flagged an access anomaly in the financial servers. A large volume of records had been accessed from an internal terminal during the gala. During the hours when almost everyone who should have been in the building was across town in a ballroom, someone had been very busy. Vivian stared at the notification for a long time. Then she opened her contacts and found the number Grant Holloway had written on the back of a Hartwell Grand cocktail napkin because he didn't have business cards and wasn't pretending otherwise. She didn't call. Not yet. She needed to understand what she was looking at before she involved anyone else. But she saved the number under his name, and she did not delete it, and she did not sleep that night at all. She called him at 6:47 in the morning. Grant was in the kitchen making oatmeal when his phone rang. Maisie's requirement was blueberries stirred in before the oatmeal cooled, not after, because after made them sad, and sad blueberries ruined the whole experience. He'd learned this through trial and error over the course of approximately 40 breakfasts. He had the blueberries ready. I was not expecting his phone to ring with a number he'd only saved 7 hours ago. He answered anyway. "I need to meet with you today," Vivian said. No greeting, no preamble. Her voice was different from last night, stripped of the careful social calibration, tighter, with something underneath it that he identified after a moment as controlled fear. The kind of fear that people with resources and options are not accustomed to feeling, which makes it worse when it arrives. "I know that's a significant ask. I know we just met. I wouldn't be calling if I had another option I trusted." Grant looked at the oatmeal, looked at the blueberries. Through the thin wall of the apartment, he could hear Maisie singing something to herself in her bedroom, a song she'd invented about a squid named Ferdinand who lived in a library, which had been her creative project for the past 3 weeks. "I work at 8, he said. "I know. I can have someone cover your shift. I can compensate." She stopped. He could hear her recalibrating. "I'm sorry, that was the wrong thing to say." "It was." He stirred the blueberries in. "But I appreciate that you recognized it." He moved the bowl to the table, set out a spoon. "Can you tell me what this is about on the phone?" "No." "Is it serious?" A pause. "I think someone is trying to destroy my company from the inside. And I think it's been happening for years. And I think last night, while I was standing in a room talking to you, they did something that tells me they're not planning to wait much longer." Grant sat down at the table. From the bedroom, Ferdinand the squid was currently engaged in what sounded like a complex negotiation with the harbor seal. "Give me the address," he said. "I'll come after I drop Maisie at school. 8:30, maybe 8:45. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I'm maintenance supervisor, Vivian. I don't know what you think I can—" "I'll explain when you get here," she said. "Please, just come." He did. Her office was on the 38th floor of a building in Midtown that her company owned outright, which she mentioned not as a boast, but as a relevant logistical fact. It meant she controlled the security systems, the access logs, the camera placement. It meant certain conversations could happen here that couldn't happen elsewhere. Grant rode the elevator with a visitor badge that a young assistant had issued him downstairs with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had been told not to ask questions and was professionally committed to that instruction. The office itself was not what he'd expected. He'd expected the standard executive architecture of power, the enormous desk positioned to maximize psychological advantage, the wall of achievements, the view arranged to remind visitors of their relative smallness. Instead, it was a working space, genuinely disordered in the way that comes from actual use rather than staged authenticity. There were 2 monitors on the desk running live data feeds, a whiteboard along one wall covered in what appeared to be a network diagram drawn and redrawn multiple times, and a side table holding 3 coffee cups in varying states of abandonment. Vivian was standing at the whiteboard when he walked in. She was wearing the same clothes as last night, he realized. She hadn't gone home. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Correct." She turned. The careful composure from the gala was mostly intact, but there were cracks in it now, around her eyes, in the set of her jaw. "Thank you for coming. Sit wherever. There's coffee, but I think it's been sitting for 2 hours. "I'm fine." He looked at the whiteboard. The network diagram was a web of names, dates, and amounts connected by lines in 3 different colors of marker. "Walk me through what you found." She did. It took 40 minutes. She spoke without notes because the information was clearly something she'd been processing all night and had committed to memory. The way you commit to memory things that frighten you, thoroughly and against your will. What she described was not a single incident. It was a pattern. Someone, or more accurately, several people working in coordinated silence, had been systematically redirecting funds from her company's vendor payment system for at least 3 years. Not enormous transfers, not the kind of numbers that triggered automatic flags. Careful, incremental movements, each one individually explainable, collectively forming a river of stolen capital that she estimated, based on what she'd been able to trace in one sleepless night, at somewhere between $40 and $80 million. Beyond the money, there was the structural damage. Partnerships that should have been secured had been quietly undermined, proposals lost, communications delayed, key contacts redirected toward competitors in ways that looked like ordinary business friction, but, laid out chronologically, formed a deliberate sequence. She had been running her company through what she now understood was a compromised apparatus, and every decision she'd made over the past 3 years had been filtered through people who were simultaneously reporting to someone else. When she finished, the room was quiet. "You haven't gone to the FBI," Grant said. "No." "Why not?" She crossed her arms. Not defensively. It was a thinking posture, the way some people pace. "Because I don't know how far this goes. If I contact federal investigators and the wrong person inside my own company finds out before I've secured the evidence, everything disappears. These people have had years to build exit routes." She looked at him. "And because I don't know yet who is and who isn't involved. My general counsel, my CFO, my head of security. I trusted all of them. I can't trust any of them right now." "You trust me," Grant said. "We met last night." "Yes. That's not rational." "I know." She didn't look apologetic about it. "But you don't work for me. You don't have anything to gain from helping whoever is doing this. And you're not from this world, which means you're not playing by this world's rules." She paused. "Also, you figured out what was wrong with that painting in about 45 seconds. You looked at something everyone else had walked past, and you saw the thing that was off. Paintings aren't corporate conspiracies. No, but the skill is the same, seeing the structure underneath the surface, understanding how things are supposed to fit together well enough to recognize when they don't." He thought about this. He looked at the whiteboard again. His eyes moved across the network of names and connections, the same way they used to move across structural drawings, looking for the load-bearing elements, the places where the weight of the whole thing was actually concentrated. "Tell me about the access anomaly from last night," he said, "the one that triggered the notification." She pulled a laptop from her desk and turned it toward him. "Internal financial server. Access logged at 11:17 p.m. Terminal located in the 4th floor accounting department during the gala." She pulled up a building schematic on the screen. "The 4th floor closes at 7 p.m. Standard. After-hours access requires a key card and a secondary PIN. The log shows the access was authorized under a code belonging to Marcus Webb, my deputy CFO." "Was Webb at the gala?" "Yes, I have photographs and 3 witnesses who place him in the ballroom from 9 p.m. onward." "So either someone had his credentials, or he gave them to someone," Vivian said. "Yes." "You need to know which one before you confront him." "I need to know considerably more than that before I confront anyone." She closed the laptop. "That's the problem. I have fragments. I have a picture that's partially assembled, and I can see enough of it to know it's bad. But I'm missing pieces that will determine everything. Who is actually running this, how many people are involved, and how they plan to finish it." "What does finish it mean?" She looked at him steadily. "I think the goal was always to remove me as CEO, not through a standard board process, through manufactured failure. Create enough damage to the company's partnerships and financials that the board has no choice but to vote me out, install someone they've already chosen, and use the chaos of the transition to cover the last phase of what they've been building." She paused. "There's a board vote in 11 days. Performance review. If the numbers look the way someone has been engineering them to look, I lose." 11 days. Grant let that land. "Why me?" he asked again. "I understand the logic you gave me, but there are investigators you could hire, people with actual experience in this. I'm hiring them too, quietly, through channels that can't be traced back to me." She sat down across from him for the first time since he'd entered. Up close, without the social armor of the previous night, she looked younger than 34. Not in a naive way. in the way that exhaustion sometimes strips people back to something more essential. But investigators work from the outside in. They read documents, they follow money, they interview people. She leaned forward. You know what I need that they can't give me? I need someone to look at the physical infrastructure, the buildings, the access points, the maintenance records. Grant went still. Our corporate campus has 3 buildings, Vivian continued, plus 17 vendor locations we contract with, data services, logistics, facilities management. These people have been operating inside our physical spaces for years, moving things, accessing things, leaving things exactly as they found them so no one would notice. She looked at him. You've spent 4 years walking through every hidden corner of a major hospital. You know what unauthorized access looks like. You know what maintenance records look like when they've been manipulated. You know how people move through buildings when they don't want to be seen because you've spent years thinking about exactly that. He was quiet for a long moment. I'd need access to everything, he said finally. Full maintenance records for all 3 buildings going back at least 3 years. Vendor access logs, HVAC system activity, elevator usage, camera coverage maps, including coverage gaps. I can get you that. I'd need to do walkthroughs, which means I need a reason to be in your buildings that doesn't attract attention. I can hire you as a facilities consultant. As of today, the paperwork will be legitimate. I'll pay you the appropriate rate. You'll have a real contract. If anyone asks, you're doing a pre-renovation assessment for a planned renovation. She paused. Is that acceptable? Grant thought about Maisie, about the school pickup at 3:15, about the fact that his actual job, the one with the health insurance that covered Maisie's pediatric appointments and the paid sick days he'd accumulated over 4 years, was something he couldn't simply set aside. I need to talk to my supervisor at this hospital, he said. I have vacation time banked. A lot of it, actually. I haven't taken any in 2 years. A beat. I can take 10 days. Something in Vivian's expression shifted. Gratitude and relief in a combination that she seemed slightly uncomfortable with, like someone who doesn't receive things gracefully because they haven't had much practice. That's more than enough. It might not be enough, he said honestly. 11 days is not a lot of time to understand a 3-year conspiracy. No, she agreed. It's not. He started that afternoon. Vivian had an office cleared for him on the 2nd floor of the main building, a small one previously used for storage, which suited him. He didn't want to be visible. He wanted to be the person whose presence was easily explained and quickly forgotten, which was something he'd had considerable practice at over the past 4 years. The maintenance records alone took 3 hours to begin making sense of. They were organized the way maintenance records at large organizations always were, technically complete, practically illegible, a sprawling accumulation of work orders and inspection logs and vendor invoices that told the story of every leaking faucet and faulty elevator door while simultaneously burying anything more significant under sheer volume. But Grant had spent 4 years reading documents exactly like these. He knew what routine looked like. He knew the texture of a maintenance log that had been kept by people doing actual maintenance, the specific patterns of which problems repeated, which repairs succeeded, and which required follow-up, the way that genuine upkeep had a rhythm to it, a logic that emerged over time. And he could see within the first 2 hours that the records for one contractor in particular didn't have that rhythm. Nexus Facilities Group, which had held the contract for grounds maintenance, security system upkeep, and structural inspection across all 3 buildings for the past 4 years, had records that were technically complete and procedurally correct, and subtly, persistently wrong in a way that he couldn't articulate yet, but could feel in the same way he could feel a structural calculation that was off. Not wrong enough to fail immediately, but carrying a stress it wasn't designed to carry. He took notes in a standard composition notebook he'd bought at a pharmacy on the way to the building. Not on the company laptop they'd provided him. Paper. Old habit from architecture. You don't trust a drawing to a single medium. At 5 o'clock, Vivian appeared in the doorway. Anything? She said. Maybe. Too early to say. He looked up. Nexus Facilities Group. Tell me about them. They've had our maintenance and security infrastructure contract for 4 years. Competitive bid process. All properly documented. They came highly recommended by... She paused. By who? By Richard Calloway, my VP of Operations. Something moved across her face. He's been with me for 6 years. I've trusted him completely. He was watching you last night, Grant said. At the gala, twice. I noticed because I was facing the room and you weren't. Vivian was silent for a moment. I noticed too, she said, the second time. You didn't mention it. I was hoping I was wrong. She leaned against the door frame. She looked like someone trying to decide how much ground she could afford to give. Richard has a family, 3 kids. He coaches his son's little league team. He's been in my office when I've cried, twice, after particularly brutal board meetings, and he never told anyone. She looked at the floor. I keep thinking there has to be another explanation. There might be, Grant said. I'm not accusing him. I'm just noting that the contractor he recommended has records that don't look right to me. He paused. Does Nexus have access to your server rooms? Structural inspection contract. Yes. Security systems? Yes. So if someone wanted access to your infrastructure without triggering internal alarms, the most efficient method would be using the contractor who already has legitimate access, Vivian finished. Her voice was quiet. Who is already supposed to be there. Who already has the keycards and the access codes because we gave them to him. She looked at the ceiling briefly. 4 years. This has been sitting inside my company for 4 years. Possibly. I need to verify it. He closed the composition notebook. I want to do a physical walkthrough tomorrow morning. All 3 buildings. I want to see every server room, every utility corridor, every space that Nexus has regular access to. I'll take you myself. No, he said. That will attract attention. Is there someone on your facilities team you're absolutely certain isn't compromised? She thought about it. Ana Reyes. She manages day-to-day building operations. She's been with me 3 years, but she came from outside. She had no prior relationship with any of the current vendor contracts. And she... Vivian paused. When I came in this morning, she was already here. She'd seen the security flag on the server access, and she was already pulling the logs before I even asked. She didn't call anyone else about it. She brought it directly to me. Call her in, Grant said. Ana Reyes was 38 years old, had the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who'd spent a decade managing physical operations for organizations that didn't function well without her, and assessed Grant in about 4 seconds when Vivian introduced him. Facilities consultant, Ana said. Not skeptical exactly. Evaluating. Pre-renovation assessment. That's the official version, Grant said. The real version is that I'm trying to understand how someone has been using this building's infrastructure in ways they shouldn't have been. Ana looked at Vivian. Vivian nodded. Okay, Ana said. What do you need? Tomorrow morning, walkthrough of every space Nexus Facilities has regular access to. I need you to act like it's a routine inspection. Not because I think anyone's watching, but because I don't want to assume no one is. Should I know what I'm looking for? Anything that shouldn't be there, or anything that should be there and isn't. Mostly I need someone who knows what this building looks like normally, so I can ask questions and get accurate answers. He paused. Can you do that without telling anyone else why? Ana looked at him for another moment. You know what's strange? She said. About 6 weeks ago, I flagged an anomaly in the Nexus inspection schedule to Richard Holloway. One of their teams had done a nighttime inspection of the East server room that wasn't on the maintenance calendar. Richard told me he'd approved it verbally and forgot to update the log. He was very relaxed about it. The room was quiet. I believed him, Ana said. At the time, I believed him. He's always been relaxed about things. It's not unusual. She stopped. But I wrote it down. In my own records. Because I always write things down. She looked at Vivian. It's a habit from my last job. My supervisor always said, if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. Can you get me those records? Grant asked. I can have them tonight, she said. That evening, Grant called the babysitter to stay an extra 2 hours, then sat in a small conference room with Ana's records and the Nexus maintenance logs, and a second cup of the terrible hours-old coffee, and worked until 9 p.m., constructing a timeline. When he was finished, he sat back and looked at it. The unauthorized nighttime inspection Ana had flagged was not a one-time event. It was the one time someone had done it without scheduling it properly in advance. The other times, 7 of them over the past 2 years, were all technically scheduled, properly logged, and completely routine on paper. Except that when you cross-reference the inspection times with the server access logs that Vivian had been reviewing, 6 of those 7 nighttime inspections coincided with periods of unusually high internal network activity. Someone was using the inspections as cover, coming in with legitimate credentials during scheduled maintenance windows, accessing the servers, doing what they needed to do, and leaving a perfectly clean paper trail in their wake. It wasn't perfect. It was very good, but it wasn't perfect. Because whoever had set it up had not anticipated that someone would look at the physical access pattern alongside the server logs simultaneously. The two record systems lived in different departments. There was no standard process for cross-referencing them. They had assumed, correctly, for 4 years, that nobody would. Grant photographed the timeline with his personal phone. Then he called Vivian. "I have something," he said when she picked up. "How certain are you?" "Certain enough that you should see it tonight." He paused. "And certain enough that you should think very carefully about who else you let into the room when I show you." She arrived within 20 minutes. He laid the timeline out on the conference table and walked her through it. She stood with her arms crossed and her jaw tight and didn't interrupt once, which he was learning was what she looked like when she was genuinely processing something as opposed to managing a conversation. When he finished, she stood there for a moment looking at the timeline. 7 times, she said, "at minimum. This is only what I can see from these two record systems. There may be other access patterns I haven't cross-referenced yet. And you found this in one afternoon." "I found the beginning of it," he said. "The thread. The question is how far it goes when you pull it." She looked up from the table. Something in her expression was harder now. Not colder, but more resolved, the way a material gets stronger under specific kinds of pressure. "I want to show you something," she said. She opened her laptop and turned it toward him. "This came in 2 hours ago. Anonymous sender, routed through 3 relay servers. My IT team flagged it and traced the routing as far as they could. It was a photograph, shot on a long lens, slightly blurred with distance. It showed Grant outside Maisie's school that morning. He recognized the blue-painted brick of the building's exterior, the corner of the fence, crouching down to Maisie's eye level, as he always did before leaving her, because she'd asked him to do that once and he'd never stopped. Maisie was reaching up to pat his face with one small hand in the way she did when she was satisfied that he was paying sufficient attention to her. Below the photograph was a single line of text. "Careful who you make curious." Grant looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. "I'm sorry," Vivian said, quietly and completely, without the professional management she put on most expressions of regret. "I'm sorry that I called you. I'm sorry that—" "Stop," he said, not unkindly. "Don't apologize yet. They know who you are. They know about Maisie." "Yes." He straightened up from the table. His voice was steady. The steadiness was real. She would understand later that this was something specific to him, a quality installed by 4 years of holding things together alone, of being the only person standing between Maisie and whatever came next. When something genuinely threatened his daughter, he did not panic. He became very, very focused. "They know who I am," which means they've been watching you, or they were watching you last night at the gala, or both. And they're worried enough about what I might find that they sent this in the first 10 hours. That should make you want to leave. It makes me want to know who took this picture. He looked at her. "You have security cameras at the gala venue?" The Hartwell Grand has an extensive system. They archive 30 days. "I want the footage from last night's exterior cameras, the approach and exit. If someone was following me or if they had a photographer positioned, they had to be there." He paused. "And I want Maisie's school to know that her pickup today needs to be by her babysitter and no one else. I need to make 2 calls. Can you give me 5 minutes?" Vivian nodded and stepped out. He called the babysitter first. Then he called the school. He was very calm on both calls and very specific, and he did not explain more than was necessary. When he came back into the conference room, Vivian was standing at the window looking at the city below. "I can have a security detail assigned to—" she began. "Not yet," Grant said. "If we put visible security on Maisie and word gets back to whoever sent this, they'll know we took the bait. They'll know I'm scared. I don't want them to know what I am yet." He sat back down at the table. "I want them to think I'm thinking about walking away." Vivian turned from the window. "Are you?" He looked at the timeline on the table, looked at the careful, patient, long-running architecture of what someone had built inside her company, the years of quiet damage, the precisely engineered theft, the structural betrayal of everything she'd worked to create. He thought about what he'd said the night before, about spaces designed to sort people, about machines that decided who belonged and who didn't. "No," he said. "I'm not walking away." He picked up his composition notebook. "Tell me everything you know about Jonathan Pryce." Vivian went still. "How do you know that name?" He turned the notebook toward her. In the margin of his timeline, circled twice, was a name that had appeared in 3 separate vendor documents as a secondary signatory, not prominently, not in any way that would attract attention on its own, but appearing consistently at the edges of the Nexus relationship and 2 other contractor arrangements. J. Pryce, secondary authorization. "He's in the paperwork," Grant said. 3 times, always secondary, always just inside the margin of what would require additional disclosure. He looked at her. "You know him." "I know of him," Vivian said carefully. "Jonathan Pryce is a private equity investor. He's been acquiring minority stakes in technology companies for years. Never enough to require board representation, always just below the threshold that would give him formal influence." Her voice had gone flat, in the way that voices go flat when someone is controlling what their voice does with some effort. "He made an informal approach to acquire a stake in my company approximately 18 months ago. I declined." "How did he take the decline?" She looked at him. "He smiled," she said. "He was very gracious. He told me he understood completely." Grant looked at the 3 circled entries in his notebook, thought about what a 3-year pattern of quiet corporate sabotage looked like when you placed it alongside an acquisition approach that had been declined 18 months ago. "He started this before you said no," Grant said. "The pattern goes back further than the approach, which means the approach wasn't a genuine offer." Vivian closed her eyes briefly. "It was a test," she said. "He wanted to see if I'd sell willingly. When I wouldn't, he activated what he'd already built." Grant looked at his notes. "He never needed you to say yes. He just needed you to say no, so he knew which phase to move to." The city hummed 40 floors below. Somewhere in the building, a cleaning crew was working their way through the hallways, the sound of a cart's wheels faint and rhythmic through the walls. A sound Grant associated with his own nightly rounds, with the particular quiet of a large building after hours, with all the things that happened in institutional spaces when the people who ran them officially had gone home. He picked up his pen and added Jonathan Pryce's name to the top of the timeline. Then he drew a line from Pryce's name downward through the network, through the contractor relationships, through the access anomalies, through the carefully manipulated financial records. And the line connected everything in the way that a load-bearing column connects a foundation to a roof. Pryce wasn't at the edges of this. Pryce was the structure underneath it. 11 days, Grant said. 10 now, Vivian corrected quietly. He nodded. He closed the notebook. He thought about Maisie reaching up to pat his face outside the school that morning, satisfied that he was paying attention, not knowing that someone with a long lens had been 40 yards away recording the moment as a warning. He was paying attention now. The walkthrough took most of the following morning. Ana Reyes moved through the buildings the way someone moves through a space they know in their bones, without hesitation, without consulting floor plans, making small corrections to Grant's orientation when he misjudged which corridor connected to which utility junction. She had the institutional memory of someone who had spent 3 years troubleshooting every problem that the official maintenance logs categorized and every problem that never made it into any log at all, which in Grant's experience was the more informative category. He didn't tell her everything. He told her enough, that he was looking for evidence of unauthorized access, that the Nexus inspections were a specific area of interest, that he needed her to behave as if this were routine and treat any anomaly she noticed as worth mentioning regardless of how minor it seemed. Ana was the kind of person who processed instructions once and then acted on them without requiring reassurance, which Grant appreciated deeply, given that reassurance was something he had very little bandwidth for at the moment. The first 2 buildings produced nothing that he couldn't explain. Maintenance corridors consistent with the logs. Server room access points showing normal wear patterns. Nexus's inspection marks, the small adhesive tags their crews left on equipment to indicate completed checks, present where they should be and dated accurately as far as he could verify. The third building was different. It was the oldest of the 3, a converted industrial structure from the 1940s that Vivian's company had acquired and renovated 8 years ago. The renovation had been thorough on the upper floors, open-plan offices, modern HVAC, updated electrical throughout. But the basement level was a different story. Down there, the original bones of the building were still largely intact. Brick walls, low ceilings, cast iron pipe runs that predated the renovation and had been incorporated rather than replaced because replacing them would have cost twice the renovation budget. It was the kind of basement that appeared in the official floor plans as utility and storage, and that most people who worked in the building had never seen. Grant had seen hundreds of basements like this. He'd designed around them, worked in them, understood them the way you understand a language you've spoken for a decade. And when Anna led him down the service stairs and through the heavy fire door at the bottom, he knew within 60 seconds that something was wrong. Not visibly wrong, not in any way that would appear in a photograph or an inspection report. But the space had a quality that he associated with spaces that were used more than their official designation suggested. A particular absence of the dust accumulation patterns that develop in genuinely low-traffic areas, a slightly too clean section of flooring near the secondary electrical panel, a faint smell that he initially couldn't place, and then did. The specific metallic plastic combination of recently active electronic equipment in an enclosed space with inadequate ventilation. "When was this floor last on an official inspection?" he asked Anna. She checked her phone, where she kept a running maintenance calendar. Nexus did a structural inspection 6 weeks ago. Before that, 4 months prior. Who else comes down here regularly? Facilities staff for the HVAC equipment. That's the main mechanical room at the end of the corridor. She paused. And the IT team has a secondary cable routing junction against the north wall. They're down here maybe once a quarter. Show me the north wall. The cable junction was a standard installation, a metal enclosure properly labeled, padlocked with the facility's standard hardware. Grant looked at it, looked at the wall behind it, looked at the floor in front of it. The concrete in front of the junction showed a wear pattern. Not from the quarterly IT visits, those would produce a single approach path, direct and consistent. This was a wider pattern, distributed, the kind that accumulated from multiple people standing in roughly the same area with slightly varying positioning over an extended period. He crouched down. The padlock on the junction was facility standard, but it was newer than the enclosure. The enclosure itself had surface oxidation consistent with its age, but the lock's hardware was bright with minimal weathering. He looked at the strike plate. Microscopic scratching at the key entry point, more than you'd expect from quarterly use. This lock has been opened significantly more often than quarterly, he said. Anna crouched beside him and looked. How can you tell? Entry wear. Locksmiths call it keying marks. The pattern distributes differently depending on usage frequency. Someone who opens a lock twice a year develops a different wear signature than someone opening it twice a month. He stood. I need Vivian to authorize an IT team member to open this enclosure. Someone she trusts, today. I can call her right now. Do that. He was still looking at the wall. Something else was bothering him. He walked the length of the north wall slowly, running his eyes along the brick. The mortar was original, a century-old lime mixture that had the particular texture of hand-finished work, consistent along most of the wall. But at one section, approximately 3 meters from the cable junction, the mortar between 2 courses of brick was a slightly different color. Not dramatically different, the kind of difference that disappeared in overhead fluorescent light but became visible when you tilted your angle and let the shadows work for you. He pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight, angling it low against the wall. The repointed section was roughly 60 centimeters wide and 40 centimeters tall. Recent work, within the past year he estimated, based on the cure color of the mortar. Whoever had done it was competent but not a professional mason, which meant the surface finish was slightly smoother than the original. Behind that repointing was something that had been accessed and then sealed back. Anna, he said, is there anything on the official record about masonry repair on this floor? She checked. No. Nothing in the Nexus structural inspection report? Nothing listed. Grant photographed the section from 3 angles, photographed the lock, photographed the floor wear pattern. Then he straightened up and looked at the space as a whole, the low brick ceiling, the old pipe runs, the inadequate lighting, the smell that shouldn't be there. This was where they'd been working. He was almost certain of it. He didn't know yet what they'd installed or removed or routed through this space, but the physical evidence of repeated unlogged access was as clear to him as a structural drawing. He called Vivian from the basement stairs, where the phone signal was marginally better. "I found something," he said. "I need a trusted IT person down here within the hour, and I need you to not react to what I'm about to say in any way that someone watching you might notice." A brief pause. "Go ahead." "Someone has been operating in your basement level, physically operating, not just accessing records from a terminal. They've been in here regularly. I think they've installed something in or near your north wall cable junction, possibly a secondary network access point or a data relay, and I think it's been there long enough to be embedded in your infrastructure in ways that won't show up in a standard audit." He paused. "If I'm right, they haven't just been reading your data. They've been sitting inside your network like a second nervous system." The silence on the other end was very controlled. He could hear her breathing. "Lena Park," she said finally. "My senior network architect. She's the only IT person I'm prepared to trust with this right now. She's worked with me for 5 years, and her relationship with every current vendor contract is zero. She came from an academic background. She has no prior history with any of these people." A pause. "I'll send her down in 45 minutes. Tell her to bring diagnostic equipment and to look like she's doing routine cable maintenance." "I'll tell her." Another pause. "Grant, how bad is this?" He looked at the repointed section of wall. "I'll know more in a few hours." Lena Park arrived in 40 minutes carrying a canvas tool bag and the expression of someone who had been given partial information and was professionally disciplined enough to work with it. She was quiet and methodical, and when Grant showed her what he'd found, she put on her glasses and looked at the cable junction and the wall for about 30 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "Give me an hour." He gave her an hour and 10 minutes. When she came to find him in the stairwell where he'd been working through the rest of the maintenance records, her face was composed in the flat, controlled way of someone containing something significant. "There's a passive network tap installed inside the cable junction," she said. "Professionally done. It's been spliced into the main fiber run. It mirrors everything passing through that line to an external receiver without interrupting the signal. It would not appear in any internal network scan because it's not a device on the network. It's a physical intercept." She paused. "Based on the hardware, I'd estimate it's been there between 14 and 20 months. 14 to 20 months. Grant did the math against the timeline he'd constructed the previous night. The installation window overlapped precisely with a Nexus structural inspection that had been scheduled with 2 days' notice, unusually short lead time, which at the time had been explained by an urgent requirement to check the building's seismic anchor points after a minor tremor had registered in the region. "The wall section," he said. "There's a secondary relay unit inside it. I didn't open it. I didn't want to disturb anything that might be evidence, but the magnetic resonance reading is consistent with a small electronic device. It's probably what boosts the tap's transmission range." She looked at him steadily. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't someone who learned from a YouTube video. This is someone with serious technical and operational capability." "Or someone who hired that capability," Grant said. "Either way." She lowered her voice. "I need to tell Vivian. She's expecting your call. Use the number she gave you directly, not the company system." Lena nodded and moved away to make the call. Grant sat on the basement stairs and looked at his composition notebook. The timeline that had started as a pattern in maintenance records had expanded over the past 36 hours into something significantly larger: a physical infrastructure compromise, a financial record manipulation, a coordinated network of insider access that reached from the executive floors down to the basement walls. Jonathan Price had not simply tried to steal from Vivian's company. He had tried to build a second company inside hers, invisible and parallel, that could be activated when the moment was right. The board vote was in 9 days. The gossip column item appeared that afternoon. Grant found out about it when his babysitter, Elena, a 26-year-old graduate student who had been watching Maisie 3 evenings a week for 2 years, and whose judgment he trusted approximately as much as he trusted anyone, texted him a link with the message, "Is this real? Should I be worried?" The item was on a New York social media blog that covered wealthy Manhattan and its various interpersonal arrangements with the enthusiasm of someone who considered gossip a civic service. The headline read, "Ashcroft's Mystery Gala Companion." Who is the man in the old suit? Beneath it was a photograph, not the hostile surveillance photograph from the previous day, but a genuine party photograph, the kind that society photographers take at these events as a matter of routine. It showed Vivian and Grant at the small table near the east wall of the Hartwell Grand Ballroom, mid-conversation, the angle catching both of their faces with the particular clarity of someone with a professional camera and a good eye. The item described Grant as an unlikely companion for New York's most guarded tech billionaire, and speculated, with the gleeful irresponsibility that characterized this form of journalism, that his presence at Vivian's side for most of the evening suggested a relationship that sources close to the Ashcroft inner circle describe as recent, but apparently significant. It was, Grant reflected, both almost entirely fabricated and almost entirely beside the point. The point being that his name, his approximate age, and his employer were now a matter of public record in a story that had already been shared 4,700 times by the time he saw it. He called Vivian. "I've seen it," she said before he could speak. "I'm sorry. This is what happens at these events. The photographers are hired by the venue, and the social pages have access to everything they shoot. I should have anticipated." "It's done," Grant said. "The question is what it means operationally." A pause. She seemed to recalibrate to his manner of addressing the problem rather than the problem's emotional weight. "It confirms your association with me publicly, which means anyone watching me now has a reason to watch you as well." "They already were watching me," he said. "The photograph of Maisie was from the day after the gala, before this article." He paused. "This doesn't change my exposure, it changes yours. It gives whoever is behind this a potential pressure point. If they think our relationship is personal rather than investigative, they may try to use you against me, or me against you, rather than simply trying to remove me from the picture." "That's a very cold way of analyzing it." "I'm trying to be useful," he said. "I can be less cold about it later." A brief silence. When she spoke again, something in her voice was slightly different. Not softer exactly, but more direct. "How is Maisie?" "She's fine. She doesn't know anything is wrong. Elena picked her up from school, and they're currently, based on the background noise I can hear, engaged in some kind of elaborate craft project involving construction paper and what I believe is an unreasonable quantity of glitter." He paused. "She's fine. I need her to stay fine." "She will," Vivian said. "I'm going to—" "Don't promise things you can't guarantee," he said. Not harshly, just with the precision of someone who had learned what promises cost when they couldn't be kept. "Tell me what's happening on your end." What was happening on her end was accelerating. The private investigators she'd engaged through a cutout arrangement, a law firm with no prior relationship to her company, hired under a corporate name that traced back to nothing, had returned their first substantive report that morning. Jonathan Price's network of connections within the New York financial and technology community was extensive, but not fully visible through standard research channels. What they had been able to establish was this: Price had controlling interest in 7 private entities, only 2 of which were publicly registered. The remaining 5 operated through a nested structure of holding companies registered across 3 different jurisdictions that together created a near impenetrable opacity. One of those 5 entities, registered in Delaware under a name that required 3 layers of corporate structure to connect back to Price, was the parent company of Nexus Facilities Group. Grant was not surprised when Vivian told him this. He had expected it. What he had not expected was the second piece of the investigator's report. Marcus Webb, Vivian's deputy CFO, whose credentials had been used to access the financial servers during the gala, had made 3 wire transfers from a personal account to an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands over the past 18 months. The amounts were not enormous, $40,000, $60,000, $75,000. But they were regular, and they were consistent with the kind of payment structure used to compensate someone for ongoing access provision rather than a one-time transaction. Webb wasn't being blackmailed into providing his credentials. He was being paid for them. "Richard Calloway," Grant said. They were in Vivian's office now. The door closed. "What does the investigator have on Calloway?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Nothing direct? No financial transfers? No documented connection to Price or any of his entities?" She set down the report. "Which is either because he's not involved or because he's been more careful." "Or because he's more trusted," Grant said. You don't need to pay someone who already believes in what you're doing. She looked at him. You think he's a true believer? In what? Corporate sabotage? I think some people convince themselves that the end justifies the infrastructure. He paused. Price would have had to sell him something, a version of the story where removing you was the right outcome, where what he was doing wasn't betrayal, it was correction. Vivian looked at the whiteboard, which by now had expanded to cover most of the available space. He told me once, about 2 years ago, that he thought I was too independent in my decision-making, that I didn't leverage my board relationships enough, that a CEO needed to be more, he used the word collaborative. She stopped. I told him I was collaborative with people I trusted. He seemed to accept that. Her jaw tightened. I wonder now what he understood by it. I want to talk to him, Grant said. No. Not directly, not about this. He paused. I want to have a casual conversation with him, about the renovation assessment, about building issues. Something that gives me a reason to ask him about Nexus without flagging that I already know what I know. He looked at her. He recommended them. That's a legitimate topic. Vivian thought about this. He'll see through it. Maybe, or maybe he's confident enough in the architecture of what they've built that a casual conversation about vendor relationships won't alarm him. Grant paused. People who build complex systems tend to trust the complexity to protect them. They forget that the complexity is itself a pattern. She studied him for a moment. You sound like someone who has thought about this before. I've designed buildings for 20 years, 10 of them professionally, 10 of them in my head, while I fixed other people's buildings. He picked up his notebook. Every structural system has a logic. Once you understand the logic, you can find the place where it's vulnerable. Not because the designer was stupid, usually because they were too smart. They built something too clever to be easily visible, and in doing so they made it too rigid to respond when the unexpected came from a direction they hadn't anticipated. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. Talk to Calloway. But Grant, be careful. I'm always careful. That's not what I mean. She looked at her hands. I mean, be careful what you learn, because some knowledge is difficult to come back from. He knew she was talking about herself as much as him. He didn't say so. So he found Richard Calloway in the corridor outside the second-floor conference rooms late that afternoon, between meetings, checking his phone with the practiced efficiency of a man who lived in the gaps between scheduled obligations. Calloway was 52, athletic in the maintained way of someone with a standing trainer appointment, with the particular ease of manner that came from 2 decades of being the most competent person in most rooms he entered. He looked at Grant with polite curiosity when Grant introduced himself, and with the specific kind of controlled neutrality that told Grant this was not the first time Calloway had heard Grant's name that day. The facilities consultant, Calloway said. Vivian mentioned the renovation assessment. How's it going? Slower than I'd like, Grant said. The basement level in the Renwick building is more complicated than I expected. The original infrastructure is layered in ways that make it hard to assess accurately. It's an old building, Calloway said, with the comfortable dismissiveness of someone for whom old buildings were primarily a real estate category. We've talked about whether it made more sense to fully gut and rebuild the mechanical level. The renovation costs keep coming up against questions of what's actually salvageable. That's worth thinking carefully about, Grant said. The original structure is sound. Better than sound, actually. They built differently in the 40s. But the challenge is that any renovation plan has to account for everything that's been added to that basement over the years. It's hard to plan around infrastructure you don't fully understand. I suppose that's true. Calloway pocketed his phone. How long do you anticipate the assessment taking? Depends what I find. Grant kept his voice neutral, conversational. Vivian mentioned that Nexus Facilities has been handling the structural inspections down there. I haven't been able to reach their project lead for the building yet. Do you know who the right contact is? Something happened in Calloway's expression. It was very brief, a quarter second of recalibration that most people wouldn't have registered. Grant registered it the way he registered everything in physical space, not through conscious analysis, but through the pattern recognition of someone who had spent years learning to read structures. Derek Chen is the account manager, Calloway said. His voice was entirely normal. He's responsive. I can send you his contact information if you need it. That would be helpful, thanks. Sure. Calloway glanced at his watch. I have a meeting. Good luck with the assessment. He moved away down the corridor with the practiced ease of someone who had handled unexpected conversations for 2 decades and knew how to exit one without appearing to flee. Grant stood in the corridor and watched him go. The quarter second of recalibration, the immediate pivot to providing contact information, removing himself as a point of contact, positioning someone else between Grant and any further questions. The slightly early check of the watch, the graceful exit. None of it was dramatic. All of it was deliberate. He went back to his temporary office and wrote it all down. He almost didn't take the call. It came at 7:48 p.m. from a number he didn't recognize, a 212 area code, New York City, but not a contact in his phone. He was at his kitchen table with Maisie, who was explaining the deep-sea pressure tolerances of giant squid, with the focused intensity she brought to all subjects she considered important, and his first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. But something made him answer. "Is this Grant Holloway?" A man's voice. Middle-aged, careful, with the particular cadence of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say, but was still nervous about saying it. "Who's calling?" "My name is Dennis Farrell. I'm Vivian Ashcroft's personal driver. I've been her driver for 3 years. A pause. "I need to speak with you. Not over the phone. Tonight, if possible." Grant was very still. "Why are you calling me instead of her?" Another pause. Longer. "Because I'm not sure she'd be willing to meet with me after what I have to tell her. And I think you might be able to make that easier." His voice tightened. "I've been doing something I shouldn't have been doing for a long time. And I need to stop, and I don't know how to stop without... I need someone to know what I know before I come forward, in case something happens." "In case something happens," Grant repeated carefully. "I've been reporting to someone about Ms. Ashcroft's schedule, her meetings, where she goes and when, every day for 3 years. I was paid to do it. I was told it was just security consulting. The man who hired me called it. Building a picture of her patterns for investor purposes." A pause. "I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded when I took the money. But I have 2 kids, and the pay was..." He stopped. "I'm not asking you to understand. I'm asking you to meet with me." Grant thought about the photograph of Maisie outside the school. "Who hired you?" he asked. "I'll tell you in person. I'll tell you everything. But in person." A shaky exhale. "I have recordings, Mr. Holloway. I've been recording my check-ins for the past 8 months. Everything. I started doing it because I got scared and I didn't know what else to do. And I thought if something happened to me, at least there would be a record somewhere." His voice dropped. "Meet with me. Please." Grant looked at Maisie, who had moved on from squid pressure tolerances and was now drawing something in a notebook that appeared to involve a submarine and a very large tentacle. She had her mother's hands, or so he'd been told, because he'd stopped being able to see Elena in Maisie's features after a while, stopped looking for her there because it made certain evenings impossible. "Text me the location," he said, "somewhere public. There's a diner on West 44th, Tom's Place. I'll be in the back booth." 1 hour, Grant said. He arranged for Elena to stay the night. He told her there was a work situation that might run late. She said she'd brought a book. He kissed Maisie on top of the head and told her he would be back before she woke up in the morning, and she told him to be careful because Ferdinand the Squid had recently informed her that the surface world was not to be trusted, which Maisie considered sound advice. "Ferdinand's a good judge of character," Grant said. "He really is," Maisie agreed seriously. Dennis Farrell was not what Grant had expected. He was 55, heavy-set, with a retired cop quality that came from the squared shoulders and the habit of sitting where he could see the door. He had a cup of coffee in front of him that he wasn't drinking. When Grant slid into the opposite side of the booth, Farrell looked at him with the exhausted eyes of a man who had made a decision that was costing him considerably. "Thank you for coming," Farrell said. "Tell me about the recordings," Grant said. Farrell reached into his jacket and placed a flash drive on the table between them. 41 recordings. 8 months of check-ins with the man who hired me. His name is Carl Whitmore. He's a managing director at a private equity firm called Ardent Capital." He paused. "Ardent Capital is owned by a holding company called Meridian Consolidated," Grant said. It was a guess based on the corporate structure the investigators had described to Vivian, the layers beneath Jonathan Price's holdings. Farrell stared at him. How did you... I've been building the same picture from a different direction. Grant looked at the flash drive. What's on the recordings? Calloway's name comes up 11 times. Webb's name comes up 7 times. Instructions about the board vote. When it was scheduled, what the outcome was supposed to be, who had been lined up to propose the motion to remove her. He swallowed. And then in the last 3 recordings, a name I don't recognize. Someone Whitmore refers to as the architect of the whole arrangement. Someone above Calloway, above Webb, above Whitmore himself. He paused. He never says it directly, but from context, from the way Whitmore talks about this person, I think it might be someone on Vivian's own board. Grant sat with this for a moment. The room around them was ordinary. Diner sounds, the smell of coffee and fried food, a television's mounted in the corner showing a sports recap with the sound off. Ordinary Tuesday evening in a city of 8 million people, most of whom were not sitting in back booths with information that could send multiple people to federal prison. You said you were scared, Grant said. What changed 8 months ago? What made you start recording? Farrell was quiet for a moment. I overheard something I wasn't supposed to hear. Whitmore on the phone, not knowing I was waiting outside his office. He said... He stopped. He said that when the transition happened, the people who had been most useful would be taken care of, and the people who had been a liability would need to be managed. His jaw worked. Managed. The way you manage a problem. I'm 60 days from being someone who knows too much to be left in a comfortable position. He looked at Grant. I have 2 kids. My oldest is 17. I've been doing something wrong for 3 years for the wrong reasons, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I'm not willing to be managed. Grant picked up the flash drive and turned it over in his fingers. I'm going to take you to Vivian Ashcroft tonight, he said. She's going to be angry. She has a right to be angry. But she's also someone who will recognize that you coming forward is more valuable than making you pay for what you did in the way she'd probably prefer. He looked at Farrell steadily. After that, you're going to sit down with the federal investigators she's been in contact with, and you're going to tell them everything. All of it. Not a curated version, everything. Will she be willing to do that? Take me to her? Grant put the flash drive in his pocket. I'll call her right now. He pulled out his phone. And Farrell, if there's anything else on those recordings beyond what you've told me, anything that affects the safety of anyone who's been involved in the investigation, you tell me right now before I make this call. Farrell looked at him. There's one more thing, he said quietly. In the second-to-last recording, Whitmore mentions that the situation with the outside consultant needed to be resolved before the board meeting, that someone was getting too close too fast and a more direct approach might be necessary. He held Grant's gaze. That was 4 days ago. I think they mean you. The diner hummed around them. Grant thought about the photograph, about Maisie's hand on his face outside the school, satisfied that he was paying sufficient attention. He was paying attention now. He called Vivian. Vivian arrived at the diner 22 minutes after Grant's call. She came alone, which he hadn't expected and probably should have. She'd told her security details she was staying in the office and slipped out through the building's service exit, a route she'd apparently memorized at some point for reasons she didn't explain. She was wearing a coat over what looked like the same clothes she'd had on that afternoon. And when she walked through the diner door and saw Dennis Farrell sitting across from Grant, she stopped completely still for approximately 3 seconds. Farrell had the decency not to speak first. He sat with his hands around his coffee cup and let her look at him, which Grant thought was the right instinct. Probably the first genuinely right instinct Farrell had acted on in 3 years. Vivian sat down, not across from Farrell, beside Grant, which he registered but didn't remark on. How long? She said to Farrell. Not a question in the conventional sense, more like the beginning of an accounting. 3 years and 2 months, Farrell said. From the second month I was employed by you. Something moved across her face. Not dramatic. The kind of pain that doesn't perform itself because it's too real for performance. The airport runs, she said. Every early flight I took. You knew my schedule before my own assistant did sometimes. Yes. Did they ever... She stopped. Started again. Was any of my personal security ever compromised because of what you told them? No, Farrell said. That I'm certain of. They wanted your movements, your meetings, who you saw privately. They never asked me for anything that would have put you in physical danger. At the time, I told myself that was a meaningful distinction. He paused. I understand now that it wasn't. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Grant stayed quiet too because this was not a moment that required his management. You have recordings, she said finally. 41, 8 months. They're on the drive He glanced at Grant, uncertain what word applied. The drive Mr. Holloway has. She looked at Grant. He placed the flash drive on the table. She looked at it without touching it for a moment, as if the object itself required a decision before she was willing to pick it up. Then she took it and put it in her coat pocket. There's a name on those recordings that you need to hear before you listen to them yourself, Grant said. Farrell, tell her about the board member, Farrell told her. He was careful and precise, repeating exactly the language from Whitmore's calls. The references to someone above all the named participants, someone whose involvement had never been made explicit, but whose authority over the entire operation was apparent from the deference Whitmore showed when discussing them. He told her what he'd heard in the phrasing, the implications, the specific phrase Whitmore had used twice, our partner at the table. Vivian listened without expression. When Farrell finished, she looked at the surface of the table for a moment. Howard Lenz, she said quietly. Grant looked at her. You're certain? No, I'm not certain of anything tonight. She lifted her eyes. But Lenz is the board member with the deepest prior relationship to the private equity world. He was a managing director at Castellan Partners for 15 years before he retired to a board advisory role. He has known Jonathan Price for at least a decade. They served together on an industry council. Their names appear in the same archived press coverage from at least 6 or 7 years ago. She paused. I never connected it. Why would I? Board members have long professional histories. Everyone in this world knows everyone. She looked almost angry at herself. He's been my strongest advocate on the board for the past 2 years, consistently supportive, voting with me on every contested resolution. Building your trust, Grant said, while the ground was being prepared under my feet. She pressed her lips together. He would know the board's internal dynamics better than almost anyone. He would know exactly what conditions would have to exist for a vote to remove me to succeed. A pause. He would know exactly how many members needed to be on the right side of that vote before it was called. The diner hummed around them. A couple of 2 booths away were arguing quietly about something domestic and persistent, the kind of argument that had clearly been running for years with no prospect of resolution. The television in the corner had moved from sports to local news. A traffic incident on the FDR, a fire in the Bronx, the small, ordinary catastrophes that filled the lower half of every broadcast. I need to contact the FBI tonight, Vivian said. Not through the law firm, directly. I have a contact, an assistant director, Marlene Cho, who I've worked with peripherally on industry cybersecurity initiatives. She knows who I am. She'll take the call. She looked at Grant. Will you come with me? Where? Back to the office. We need to make copies of everything. The maintenance documentation, the corporate records, the timeline you built, Lena's findings from the basement, all of it. And we need to organize it in a form that federal investigators can work from quickly. She paused. 8 days. That's what we have before the board vote. 7, Grant said. It's past midnight. She looked at him. Something moved in her expression, acknowledgement, and something harder to categorize beneath it. 7 days, she agreed. She turned back to Farrell. You'll need to speak with the FBI. Everything you've told us and everything on those recordings. I won't help you avoid the consequences of what you've done, but I also won't make your cooperation harder than it needs to be. She stood. Can you come to the building now? Farrell looked like a man who had been expecting worse and wasn't quite sure what to do with the absence of it. Yes, he said. Yes, I can. They worked until 4 in the morning. The evidence package that took shape over those hours was unlike anything Grant had built before, but the process was not entirely foreign. It was structural work, in its way. Establishing what load-bearing elements existed, how they connected, where the critical junctions were. The difference between a building and a case was mostly a matter of vocabulary. Lena Park came in at midnight and spent 2 hours extracting a forensic image of the data from the basement network tap before the FBI's own technical team could do it, ensuring they had an independent copy that couldn't be challenged as compromised by the investigation process. Ana Reyes arrived at 1 a.m. with 3 years of her personal maintenance anomaly notes. the kind of parallel record-keeping that her previous supervisor had trained her to maintain and that she'd never stopped doing, which turned out to document 17 incidents of irregular nexus activity that had never been formally reported because, individually, none of them had seemed significant enough to escalate. Individually. 17 incidents, individually insignificant, collectively a corroborating map of exactly when and how the basement infrastructure had been accessed, modified, and maintained by people who weren't supposed to be there. Grant cross-referenced Anna's notes against his own timeline, and the resulting document was dense and specific and entirely compelling, the kind of evidence that didn't require interpretation because the pattern spoke clearly enough without commentary. Vivian spent 90 minutes on the phone with Marlene Cho, the FBI assistant director, beginning at 2 a.m. He could hear pieces of the conversation through the partially open office door, Vivian's voice measured and precise, going through the substance without editorializing, presenting what they had with the same directness she'd used when she'd first laid out the problem to him. No drama. No appeals. Just the architecture of what had been done to her company, laid out brick by brick until the structure of it was undeniable. When she came back into the conference room where Grant was still working, her face was tired in a way that had moved past the manageable tiredness of earlier in the week into something more fundamental. She sat down across from him and put both hands flat on the table. "Cho is sending a team at 9 a.m., she said. "She wants everything we have, and she wants it organized by actor rather than chronology. Each individual's specific actions documented separately so the warrants can be drawn against specific people." She looked at the stacks of organized documentation on the table. She also said, she paused. She said if what we have is as substantive as it appears from the summary, they'll want to move on the board meeting rather than around it. Use the scheduled event as the point of action rather than attempting to preempt it. "Meaning they let the meeting proceed," Grant said. "Meaning they let the meeting proceed, they let the vote happen, and they use whatever actions Price and Lenz take during the meeting as additional documented evidence of the conspiracy." She looked at him. "Which means I have to walk into that boardroom in 7 days knowing who in the room has been working to destroy me, and I have to sit there and let the vote happen. Can you do that?" She thought about it honestly, which he'd learned was what she did. She didn't answer quickly when the honest answer required consideration. "I don't know," she said. "I've spent the last 4 years building something in this company. Every decision I've made, every partnership, every hire. I've been doing it through a compromised system and I didn't know. I've been making plans with broken instruments and believing in the results." She looked at the whiteboard, which had been transported to this conference room and now covered most of one wall. "The part that's hardest isn't the betrayal, it's the recalculation. Going back through 4 years of decisions and trying to figure out which outcomes were real and which were engineered." "Not tonight," Grant said. She looked at him. "You can't do that recalculation tonight," he said. "You don't have the information you need to do it accurately yet, and doing it with incomplete information will just produce conclusions that you'll have to redo later. Tonight you finish the documentation package, you sleep for 4 hours, and you meet with Cho's team at 9. He paused. "The recalculation can happen after." She looked at him for a moment. "You're very practical for someone who's essentially been doing counterintelligence work for a week." "I've been doing crisis management for 4 years, he said. "The scale is different. The principle isn't." She almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but the near miss of it was there. "How is Maisie sleeping through all of this?" "She has no idea any of this is happening. As far as she's concerned, I've been doing a very interesting job assessment for a nice lady." He paused. She did ask this morning if the nice lady had ever seen a giant squid, because apparently that's now her primary metric for evaluating whether a person is worth knowing. This time the smile completed itself briefly before the exhaustion reclaimed it. "I haven't," Vivian said, "seen a giant squid. I'll tell her you're working on it, but..." The FBI team arrived at 8:57 the following morning, which Grant registered as a good sign. Federal investigators who arrived 3 minutes early were investigators who had already reviewed the preliminary material and taken it seriously. There were 4 of them. Cho herself, a compact woman in her mid-50s with the kind of contained authority that doesn't need to announce itself. 2 agents whose roles became apparent from the way they immediately began cataloging and photographing the physical documentation. And a forensic financial analyst named Torres, who looked at the corporate records Grant had assembled and spent about 90 seconds with them before looking up at Grant with an expression that was some combination of professional appreciation and mild alarm. "Who put this together?" Torres asked. "I did," Grant said. Torres looked at him. "What's your background in forensic accounting?" "I don't have one. I'm an architect." Torres looked back at the timeline. "You're telling me an architect built a cleaner financial evidence map than most of my colleagues would have produced in the same time?" He understood the structural logic before he understood the specific financial instruments, Vivian said from across the table. He knew what the pattern was supposed to look like before he knew what the numbers meant. He worked backward from the structure to the details. Torres looked between them. "Okay," he said. "Walk me through it." Grant walked him through it. The whole thing. The maintenance records, the physical infrastructure compromise in the basement, the Nexus connection to Price's holding company structure, the payment records for Webb, the Farrell recordings, the cross-reference timeline of server access and physical building access. Torres asked precise questions and wrote precise notes, and when Grant finished, Torres sat back and looked at the ceiling briefly in the way of someone running calculations. "This is enough for warrants," Torres said to Cho. "Multiple counts. Financial fraud, wire fraud, corporate espionage, conspiracy. The network tap alone is a federal offense 3 times over." Cho nodded. She had been mostly listening, but Grant had the sense that she processed information in large quantities and was well ahead of the conversation at any given moment. "The board meeting," she said to Vivian. "We want it to proceed as scheduled." "I know," Vivian said. "We'll have agents in position, but the meeting itself needs to look entirely normal until we have what we need from the recording. We need Price, if he's present, to take an action in that room that we can document directly. And we need Lenz to make his move on the vote before we move." She paused. "Can you manage that?" "Sit in a room with the people who have been destroying my company for 3 years and act normal?" Vivian said. "Yes, I can manage that." Cho looked at her steadily. "Some people can't. In my experience, the people who think it will be easy are the ones who fall apart in the room. The people who admit it's going to be hard are usually the ones who hold it together." "I'll hold it together," Vivian said. The 6 days that followed were the strangest of Grant's professional life, and his professional life had included a period of fixing ceiling tiles above a hospital ICU while managing a full-time grief that he'd never properly sat down with because sitting down with it would have meant setting down Maisie, which he wasn't willing to do. He continued coming into the office each day under the cover of the renovation assessment, maintaining the ordinary rhythms of a consultant doing methodical building work. He had 2 more conversations with Calloway, both deliberately unremarkable. Questions about the renovation timeline, about vendor contract structures, about the building's mechanical history. Calloway was smooth and consistent and gave nothing additional away, which was itself informative. A genuinely innocent person would have given something away by now, some variation in behavior prompted by the awareness that things were shifting around them. Calloway's absolute consistency told Grant that he was monitoring the situation carefully and had decided that his most useful posture was one of normalcy. That took discipline and it took confidence. Both of those things made Grant careful. He went home each evening at a reasonable hour. He made dinner. He sat with Maisie while she told him about Ferdinand the Squid's latest discoveries and about what had happened at school and about the extremely unfair situation regarding screen time that she felt required urgent renegotiation. He read to her at bedtime. They were working through a book about ocean exploration, which had been Maisie's selection for the 3rd week running, and which Grant had started to find genuinely interesting independent of its role as a parenting obligation. On the 4th night, he was sitting on the edge of her bed after she'd fallen asleep. The book closed in his hands, and he sat there for longer than he usually did. The apartment was quiet, in the way it was always quiet after Maisie was asleep. A different quality of quiet than the quiet of the 11 hours before she woke up each morning. Fuller somehow, because she was still in it. He thought about what Vivian had said, about walking into a room with people who had been working against her for years and holding herself together. He thought about what it cost a person to hold themselves together when the thing requiring it was not an emergency, but a slow, deliberate, sustained effort of will. He thought about the 4 years since Elena had died, about the version of holding together he'd been doing, the version that got Maisie to school and to her pediatric appointments, and through her nightmares and into a childhood that was imperfect and sometimes hard and genuinely good despite everything. About the version of himself that had come out on the other side of that holding together. Not a better version, not a worse one. A more specific one, someone who had learned what he was made of. Not because he'd wanted to, but because the alternative was falling apart in front of a 2-year-old, and that was not acceptable. He put the book on the nightstand and went to bed. On the 6th day, 3 things happened in sequence that changed the nature of everything. The first was a call from Torres at the FBI, who informed Grant and Vivian that the forensic team had fully analyzed the data extracted from the basement network tap and had found not only the mirror data stream they'd expected, but a second function, a delayed release data corruption package embedded in the company's core financial reporting software that was scheduled to trigger 72 hours before the board meeting. It would have systematically introduced errors into the previous 18 months of financial records, creating discrepancies that would appear to confirm the narrative of Vivian's financial mismanagement that Price's people had been building. It was, Torres said, with the flat effect of someone who had seen considerable things in his career, one of the more sophisticated financial sabotage mechanisms he'd encountered in 17 years of this work. They had disarmed it the previous evening. No one in the company, including Holloway, including Webb, would know it had been found until the moment that discovery was used against them. The second thing was a call from Cho, who told Vivian that Howard Lenz had made contact with Jonathan Price's personal attorney at 9 that morning through a phone number connected to a relay service. The content of the call was not yet accessible, but the contact itself was now documented, and it was the specific confirmation of Lenz's active participation that the FBI had needed to complete the warrant package. The warrants were signed at 2:17 in the afternoon. The third thing was a conversation that Grant had not anticipated, and that did not fit neatly into the operational framework of everything else. Vivian came to his temporary office at 5 p.m., closed the door, and sat across from him with the specific expression of someone who has decided to say something they've been not saying for a specific reason and has concluded that the reason is no longer sufficient. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Okay." "When this is over," she stopped. "I don't mean immediately. I mean when the legal process is underway, when the company is stabilized, when you've gone back to your actual life." She paused. "Would you consider returning to architecture?" He looked at her. "That's what you wanted to ask me." "There's a project," she said. "I've been sitting on it for 2 years, a community building in the South Bronx. Mixed use, designed to serve a neighborhood that lost its primary community center to a development deal that didn't deliver what it promised. I bought the lot when the deal fell through because I thought maybe eventually I'd figure out what to do with it." She paused. "I'd like to figure out what to do with it. With someone who understands that a building is only good if the people who use it actually experience it as good." He looked at her for a moment. "You're offering me a commission. I'm asking if you'd be willing to consider one." She looked at him evenly. "And I'm asking in a way that is separate from everything else. From the investigation, from whatever the gossip pages think is happening between us, from any sense of obligation on your part. I'm asking because I watched you spend a week looking at the bones of 3 buildings and understanding them in a way that most people who study buildings professionally can't, and because the reading room in that Queens library still has north-facing windows 30 years later because you knew that right light mattered more than impressive light." He hadn't told her about the library in detail. She'd done the research herself at some point, which was, he didn't know what that was exactly, but it sat somewhere in him with more weight than he'd expected. "I'd need to think about it," he said. "I'd need to make sure Maisie's situation doesn't change." "Of course. And I'd need it to be a real commission, not something structured as charity." "The appropriate rate," she said. "Real scope, real budget, real timeline." He nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." "That's all I'm asking." She stood. "The press conference is tomorrow morning at 10. This was the piece of the plan that had been debated most extensively with Cho and with Vivian's attorney. The question of whether Vivian should hold a public press conference before the board meeting, releasing her own account and the evidence supporting it, or whether to let the FBI's operation speak entirely through the legal process. The FBI had initially wanted the quieter approach. Vivian had pushed back with a persistence that, Grant had observed, she generally reserved for things she felt very certain about. Her argument was structural, a word she'd started using in the past week with a frequency that suggested she'd absorbed it from somewhere. The structural problem with the quiet approach was that it required the company's investors, employees, and partners to receive the story of what had happened through the filtered medium of law enforcement announcements and legal proceedings, which would take months and would be narrated by people who were not Vivian. The structural solution was to put Vivian's voice into the story first, before it was shaped by other hands, so that the people who needed to trust her company had a reason to maintain that trust through the disruption that was coming. Cho had conceded the logic. She'd asked only that the press conference happened simultaneously with the FBI's operational moves, that the moment Vivian began speaking, the warrants were being executed. "Are you ready?" Grant asked. She considered the question the way she always considered direct questions, actually not performatively. "I've been writing my own corporate statements for 10 years, she said. "But I'm not going to read a statement tomorrow. I'm going to talk." She paused. "That's harder. Reading a statement means the moment you rehearsed is the moment you deliver. Talking means you have to be present. You have to trust that what you actually think is enough." "It's enough," he said. "You don't know what I'm going to say." "No," he agreed. "But I've watched you think for a week. What you actually think is enough." She was at the podium by 10:03. The press conference was held in the lobby of the main building, a space with high ceilings and glass walls that looked out onto the street, chosen because it was hers, because it belonged to the company she'd built, because standing in a hotel conference room or a rented venue would have told the wrong story about who was in control of the situation. There were more reporters than Grant had expected. The story had clearly moved through media channels in the hours since the press conference was announced, seeded by the same kind of leaks that had been working against Vivian for years, but now, finally, working towards something rather than away from it. Camera crews lined both sides of the lobby. Reporters who covered technology, business, and finance stood alongside people who covered crime and federal investigations, which told Grant that the FBI's operational moves had already begun, and that at least some of what was happening was finding its way into the news cycle. He stood at the back of the room, next to Anna, who had come down from upstairs when the press began arriving, and who was watching the front of the room with the focused calm of someone who understood what was at stake. "Has she done this before?" Grant asked quietly. "Press conferences, yes," Anna said. "Not like this." Vivian stood at the podium and looked at the room for a moment before she spoke. It was not the practiced 2-second pause of someone using a rhetorical technique. It was a real moment, someone collecting themselves before something they could not take back. Then she started talking. She did not read a statement. She talked about her company, when she'd started it, what she'd wanted it to do, what it had become. She talked about the people who worked there, not in aggregate terms, not as our valued employees, but specifically with the accumulated knowledge of someone who had actually learned who they were. She talked about what it felt like to discover that the infrastructure of an enterprise you'd built over 10 years had been occupied by people who saw it as a mechanism rather than a community. She talked about the evidence without drowning in it, clear, precise, unflinching. She named the mechanism of the fraud, the scale of it, the duration. She did not name Lenz. Cho had been explicit about that. Naming a board member in public before the arrest created legal complications. But she described the scope of the conspiracy with enough specificity that anyone in the room who was following the financial press would be able to do the arithmetic. She talked about the board vote. "In 6 days," she said, "there is a scheduled performance review before my board of directors. I understand now that this meeting was intended to be the culminating moment of a long campaign to remove me as CEO through manufactured evidence of failure. I'm here this morning because I want the people who work for this company and the people who have partnered with it and the investors who have trusted it to know the truth of what has been happening before that meeting takes place, not after." She paused. "I'm not afraid of a board vote. I'm afraid of the wrong story being told about something I built, and about the people who helped me build it. That is the only thing that could have brought me to this podium today." At the back of the room, Grant's phone vibrated with a message from Torres. "First arrest executed 10:09. Webb and 3 Nexus executives in custody. Price's team moving now. Lenz being detained for questioning as of 10:12. Clean operation so far." He looked up from the phone. At the front of the room, Vivian was answering the first reporter's question. Something aggressive about whether she could survive the board vote even without the conspiracy. with the particular composure of someone who was operating from a place of genuine rather than performed certainty. Grant had spent a week looking at structures, at the way things were built and the way they failed, and the way the failure of one element transferred load to adjacent elements that sometimes held and sometimes didn't. He had spent a week understanding the specific architecture of what had been built against her and working backward from its logic to its source. He had not spent much time thinking about what it looked like when someone decided to answer force with transparency instead of force, when someone chose the approach that required the most exposure, standing in a glass-walled room with cameras pointed at her, speaking without the protection of prepared language, because she believed the exposure was the point. That being seen clearly was more defensible than being defended carefully. The room was full and loud and bright with camera lights, and Vivian stood in the middle of it without flinching, answering questions with the composure of someone who knew that what she was saying was true and had decided that truth, plainly delivered, was sufficient. Anna, beside him, let out a quiet breath. "She's good," she said softly. "Yeah," Grant said. His phone vibrated again. "Price in custody, 1019. Federal holds on all related accounts. You're going to want to tell Ashcroft, Lenz is cooperating, already talking. It's over." He looked at the message for a moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket and kept watching. It wasn't over in any of the ways that actually mattered. The legal process would take months. The company's reconstruction would take longer. The particular damage done to Vivian's ability to trust the people around her was the kind of damage that didn't resolve on a timeline. He knew enough about the aftermath of loss and betrayal to know that the moment the acute crisis ended was frequently the moment the harder, quieter work began. But in this room, at this hour, with Vivian's voice moving steadily through question after question and the cameras recording and Torres's message sitting in his pocket, in this specific moment, the architecture of what Price and Lenz and Calloway and Webb had built for 3 years was coming apart at every load-bearing joint simultaneously. He had found the structure underneath the surface. He had followed the logic of it to its source. And Vivian had stood up in front of a glass wall on a Tuesday morning and told the truth about it, which turned out to be the only structural intervention that mattered. He stayed until the press conference ended. He watched reporters file out, watched the camera crews break down their equipment, watched Vivian's communications team materialize around her with phones and tablets, and the accumulated urgency of an organization that had just done something significant and was beginning to understand the scope of what came next. Vivian looked across the lobby and found him standing at the back. She didn't say anything. Too far, too much noise, too many people between them. But there was a recognition in it, the specific acknowledgement between two people who have been through something together that has rearranged the way they understand each other. He nodded once. She nodded back. Then her communications director was at her shoulder with something requiring immediate attention, and she turned to handle it, and Grant put on his coat and went to pick up his daughter from school. The board meeting happened anyway. Cho had explained the tactical reasoning clearly enough that Vivian had accepted it without argument, allowing the scheduled meeting to proceed, even with 3 board members absent due to federal detention and 1 under active investigation, created a cleaner legal record than canceling it. The remaining board members, those with no documented connection to the conspiracy, needed to be given the opportunity to act on the information that had now become public. Vivian's retention as CEO needed to be a decision made by a legitimate board in a legitimate session, not a default outcome produced by the collapse of the opposition. So at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, 6 days after the press conference, and 8 days after Grant had first walked into her building with a composition notebook and no particular plan, Vivian sat at the head of her boardroom table and looked at 7 of the 11 faces that were supposed to be there. The empty chairs were not subtle. Nobody pretended they were. The vote to retain her as CEO passed 6-1. The single dissenting vote came from a board member named Gerald Frost, who was 73 years old and had opposed every significant decision Vivian had made in the past 4 years on the grounds that she moved too quickly and consulted too infrequently, and who voted against her retention not out of conspiracy, but out of the genuine and consistently held belief that she was the wrong person for the job. Vivian had known this about Gerald for 4 years. She respected the consistency of it even when it frustrated her. Afterward, in the hallway outside the boardroom, Gerald stopped beside her. "For what it's worth," he said gruffly, What you did at that press conference was the right call. I still think you're too impulsive, but you were right about that. Thank you, Gerald, she said. Don't read too much into it, he said, and walked to the elevator. She stood in the hallway for a moment after he left. Then she laughed, briefly, quietly, the kind of laugh that isn't about anything being funny, so much as about the accumulated pressure of a long period of sustained tension finding a sudden small exit. A passing assistant looked at her with polite concern. She waved him off. She called Grant from the hallway. 6-1, she said when he picked up. Who voted against? Gerald Frost. A pause. The one who's been voting against you for 4 years on principle. Yes. Good, Grant said. You need at least one person on your board who isn't afraid of you. She leaned against the hallway wall. Through the glass partition, she could see the boardroom, the empty chairs, the city beyond the windows. It's done, she said. The vote part of it, anyway. The legal part takes considerably longer, he said. Torres told me this morning that the financial fraud case alone is likely to take 18 months to 2 years to fully prosecute. The civil suits will run parallel and probably longer. I know. She was quiet for a moment. How's Maisie? Annoyed that I'm not home yet. She has a presentation at school tomorrow about cephalopod intelligence, and she feels I am insufficiently prepared to help her rehearse. A pause. I should probably get home. Go, she said. Grant. She stopped. Yeah. She looked at the empty chairs in the boardroom. She thought about what Gerald Frost had said. Not the compliment, which she'd take and move on from, but the critique beneath it. Too impulsive. She'd heard that her whole career. She'd mostly treated it as the complaint of people who were slower than she was, which was probably sometimes true and probably sometimes a convenient way of not hearing something worth hearing. Thank you, she said, for all of it. I know that doesn't cover it. It doesn't need to cover it, he said. Go talk to your board. I'm going home to study giant squid. The months that followed were not a clean resolution. Grant had understood this would be the case, and Vivian had understood it intellectually. But there's a particular quality to living inside a complicated aftermath that no amount of anticipation fully prepares you for. The way it stretches and then compresses. The way some days feel like genuine forward movement and others feel like the whole thing is a tar pit designed specifically to exhaust you. Richard Calloway was arrested 5 weeks after the press conference. The delay had been a matter of building the evidentiary case against him specifically, since he'd been careful enough that the direct financial evidence required more forensic work than the cases against Webb and the Nexus executives. When Torres finally called Vivian with the news, she was in a staff meeting and she excused herself and went to her office and sat for a long time without doing anything in particular. When Grant called her that evening to ask how she was, she said she didn't know yet. He said that was a reasonable answer. It was not, she discovered, about being glad. She had expected some satisfaction in it, the completion of an accountability loop, the particular closure of watching a specific wrong receive a specific consequence. What she actually felt was more ambiguous than that. Calloway had been someone she'd trusted, and trust, once it has been extended and then revealed as misplaced, doesn't simply convert into its opposite. It becomes something more uncomfortable, a residue that lingers in the space where certainty used to be. She told Grant this one evening in late November, sitting in the corner booth of a quiet restaurant on the Upper West Side. Not Tom's Place with its diner fluorescence and its terrible coffee, but somewhere she'd chosen partly because she liked the food, and partly because it was the kind of place where a woman and a man could sit for 2 hours without being photographed, which had become a relevant logistical consideration. I think I expected to feel clear, she said. After everything, I thought when it was over I'd feel clear. It's not over, Grant said. That's part of it. The legal part. But she looked for the word. The experience of it. The sense of it as a thing that happened and then stopped happening. I thought that would feel different than this. When Elena died, Grant said, and the name still did something specific to his voice when he said it, a catch that 4 years hadn't smoothed entirely away. People kept talking about closure. Like there was a point I was supposed to reach where the fact of it became settled and stopped being active. He looked at his water glass. There isn't a point like that. There's just, you carry it differently over time. It gets distributed differently, but it doesn't close. Vivian looked at him. Do you think you'll ever stop? She wasn't sure how to end the question. Missing her? He considered it. No, but I've stopped missing the life I thought I was going to have with her. That took longer. He paused. Maisie helps. Not because she replaces anything, that's not how it works, but because she requires me to be present in a way that doesn't leave much room for living in the wrong tense. He half smiled. She informed me last week that she's decided to become a marine biologist who also designs buildings, because she feels both fields have been insufficiently connected. That sounds like a reasonable career assessment. She's 6.5, Grant said. She has time to refine it. They ate. The restaurant was warm and not too loud, and the food was the kind of food that required your attention, which meant the conversation moved in and out of the comfortable silences that develop between people who have been through something together and no longer feel the need to fill the air between them with noise. At some point, over the second glass of wine, Vivian said, I've been thinking about the Bronx project. Grant put his fork down. I looked at the lot last week, she said. I went by myself, early morning, before anyone was around. It's larger than I remembered, or maybe I just see it differently now than I did when I acquired it. She paused. The street it's on has a school 2 blocks north and a small park 3 blocks south, and nothing in between that serves the people who actually live there. It's a gap in a neighborhood that has a lot of gaps. What's on the lot now? A chain link fence and 2 years of accumulated decision avoidance. She looked at him. I want to do something real with it, not a showpiece, not something designed to look good in a foundation report, something that actually functions the way the community needs it to function, which means I need someone to go talk to the community before a single drawing is made, and then make the drawings fit what they find rather than the other way around. Grant was quiet for a moment. He knew the neighborhood she was describing. He'd done a site assessment for a project nearby in his 3rd year of practice, a project that had ultimately not been built due to funding complications. And the area had stayed in his memory the way sites sometimes did, with their specific quality of light and their particular relationship to the street grid. That's not how most development clients want to approach a project, he said. I know, I'm not most development clients. It's slower. It's more expensive in the preliminary phase. The design will probably be messier because real community input is messy. It's contradictory. It's emotional. It changes as you go. I know that too. He looked at her. You're asking me to commit to something that could take 3 years minimum from first conversation to ribbon cutting, probably longer. Yes. And you're asking me because you think I can do it. I'm asking you because I watched you spend a week understanding the bones of 3 buildings without anyone explaining them to you, she said. And because the reading room in that Queen's library has north-facing windows. And because I think you've been doing other people's maintenance for 4 years and you're ready to build something of your own again. She paused. But mainly because I trust your judgment, and I don't say that easily anymore. The restaurant moved around them. Other people's conversations, the movement of servers, the ordinary commerce of a Tuesday evening in a city that did not stop for private moments of decision. Grant picked up his fork. Put it back down. I need to involve Maisie in the process, he said finally. Not in a token way. She has opinions about buildings, and most of them are good. Vivian didn't smile at this. She took it seriously, which was the right response. That seems appropriate, she said. And I'll need an office, a real one, not a converted storage room. I'll find you space in the Renwick building, the renovated basement, once the FBI releases it as an evidence site. A slight pause. There's something fitting about that, maybe? Maybe, he said. And I want the contract to include a clause that gives the community board veto authority over any design element that doesn't serve the building's actual users. Not advisory authority, actual veto. She looked at him. You know that's going to complicate. Yes, I know. That's the clause. A moment passed. Right, she said. That's the clause. He nodded slowly. Then yes, he said. I'll do it. Maisie met Vivian for the first time on a Saturday in early December at a small park near Grant's apartment that Maisie had selected as the appropriate venue because it had a good climbing structure and because she believed that people revealed their true character on climbing structures in a way that flat ground did not allow. Grant had explained to Maisie only that Vivian was someone he'd been working with, someone he was going to continue working with, someone he thought Maisie might like. Maisie had asked 3 questions. Did Vivian like squid? Had Vivian ever built anything? And was Vivian the nice lady from before? Grant had answered he wasn't sure, not yet, but she was learning, and yes. Maisie had considered this information and said, okay, she can come to the park. Vivian arrived in jeans and a coat that cost more than the park's annual maintenance budget, which she could not do anything about, and stood for a moment at the park entrance looking at Maisie on the climbing structure with the particular expression of someone who has had very little experience with 6-year-olds and is trying to figure out the appropriate approach. Maisie looked down from the climbing structure and assessed Vivian with the frank, unselfconscious evaluation of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't doing it. Do you know how deep the ocean is? Maisie asked. Not exactly, Vivian said. Pretty deep. The deepest part is almost 11 kilometers. It's called the Challenger Deep. Maisie tilted her head. Most people don't know that. I didn't know that, Vivian said honestly. That's okay, Maisie said, with the magnanimity of someone granting a significant dispensation. You can learn. She climbed down from the structure and stood in front of Vivian at close range, looking up at her with the same focused attention she brought to things she was genuinely interested in understanding. My dad says you build companies. I do. He builds buildings. She seemed to weigh these two facts against each other. He's good at it. He designed the library in Queens with the good windows. I know, Vivian said. I've been to see it. Something shifted in Maisie's expression, a recalibration. You went to see it? Last month. I went on a Tuesday morning when it opened. I sat in the reading room for about an hour. She paused. Your dad was right about the light. It's the best kind of reading light I've ever sat in. Maisie looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Grant, who was standing slightly to the side, watching both of them with the careful attention of a man who has learned not to interfere with negotiations he didn't initiate. She went to see the library, Maisie said to him. I know, Grant said. Maisie said. This appeared to conclude some internal deliberation because she turned back to the climbing structure. You can push me on the swings if you want, she said to Vivian, but I have to warn you, I go very high. I can manage that, Vivian said. The community center project broke ground. 14 months later, in February of the following year, on a cold morning with a wind off the river that made the small ceremony uncomfortable enough that people held their coffees in both hands and kept their speeches short. Vivian spoke for 4 minutes. Grant spoke for 3. A woman named Rosa Delgado, who chaired the neighborhood community board and who had been Grant's primary contact through 8 months of listening sessions and revised drawings, and the specific productive friction of trying to build something that a real community actually wanted, rather than a community you'd imagined in a conference room, spoke for 6 minutes and was the most compelling speaker of the 3. Maisie attended in a coat that was slightly too thin for the weather and a hat with a knitted squid on it, which she had requested specifically for the occasion. She stood next to Grant during the speeches with the patient stillness she was developing. She was 7 now, and the focused intensity was becoming something more directed, channeled towards specific interests with an increasing precision that Grant found both wonderful and mildly terrifying to observe. Afterward, while the small crowd of neighbors and city officials and community board members dispersed toward the tables of coffee and pastries that Ana Reyes had organized with characteristic efficiency, Maisie went to stand at the edge of the lot and look at it. Grant went to stand beside her. The lot was empty except for the equipment that had been delivered that morning and the stake markers that defined the building's footprint. Snow had been forecast for the following week. The ground was frozen. From where they stood, you could see the school 2 blocks north and hear, faintly, the sound of the park 3 blocks south. It's going to be here a long time, Maisie said. If we build it right, Grant said, you'll build it right. She said it without hesitation, as a fact rather than encouragement. She looked at the lot for another moment. Will there be good windows? North-facing reading room on the 2nd floor, he said. Same principle as the library. And a community kitchen on the ground floor with east-facing windows so the morning light comes in while people are cooking. He paused. And a room for kids on the south side that gets afternoon light, because afternoon light is better for drawing and building things and figuring out what you want to be. Maisie considered this architectural decision seriously. That's good, she said. That's the right call. Vivian appeared beside them. She had a coffee in each hand. She'd brought 2 from the table, one for her and one for Grant. Without being asked, which was the kind of small learned attention that had accumulated over the past year in the way that real knowledge of another person accumulates, incrementally, imperfectly, through the specific texture of ordinary moments rather than grand ones. She handed Grant his coffee and stood on the other side of Maisie, looking at the lot. "How long?" she asked. 2 years if everything goes well, Grant said. 2.5 if it doesn't. "And if the community board changes the kitchen layout again?" 3, he said, "but Rosa will keep them reasonable." Vivian looked at the lot, at the stake markers, at the frozen ground that would, in 2 years or 2.5 or possibly 3, hold a building where people could cook and read and draw and figure things out. She thought about the Hudson River School painting at the Hartwell Grand Gala, the one with the spatially incorrect perspective and the emotionally true light. And she thought about Grant saying that the math could be wrong and the experience still right. She thought about the experience of the past. 14 months. The legal depositions, and the board restructuring and the company rebuilding, and the slow, nonlinear process of learning to trust her own judgment again after discovering how thoroughly it had been manipulated. The therapist she'd started seeing in January, who had the unsentimental practicality of someone who had heard every variety of self-protective story and was interested only in what was actually true. The board she'd reconstituted with people she'd chosen this time with different criteria, not just competence and alignment, but the capacity to tell her when she was wrong, the way Gerald Frost had always done, uselessly and correctly. The press had moved on from the scandal with the efficiency that characterized its engagement with everything, thoroughly for 3 months, intermittently for 6, and then largely elsewhere. Jonathan Price had entered a plea agreement that would become public in the spring. Howard Lenz had cooperated fully with federal investigators and would spend the next several years in a legal process that would consume everything he'd built. Richard Calloway had been the most complicated. His cooperation had been partial, his remorse had been performed rather than genuine, and his sentencing was still pending before a federal judge who had a reputation for not being moved by performed remorse. Webb had cooperated fully from the first day and was receiving the reduced consequences that full cooperation produced, which was not the same as no consequences, and which Vivian had made her peace with in the way you make peace with things that are imperfect but functional. Dennis Farrell had testified for the prosecution in 2 separate proceedings and had been permitted to plead to a single count of conspiracy with a sentence that included community service and probation. He had left New York with his family and was, according to the last information Vivian had received, working as a driver for a regional company in Pennsylvania. She did not think about him often. When she did, she felt something complicated and left it complicated, because she had learned over the past year that resolving complexity into simplicity was usually a way of lying to yourself about how things actually were. The company's financial reconstruction had taken 9 months and had been the most technically demanding period of her professional life. Understanding the full scope of what had been done, unwinding it, explaining it to partners and investors with the combination of transparency and forward momentum that kept them from leaving, rebuilding the systems that had been compromised with the specific knowledge of how they'd been compromised. She had kept Ana Reyes as her head of facilities and operations and given her significantly expanded authority. She had promoted Lena Park to Chief Technology Officer, and they had spent 4 months rebuilding the company's entire network infrastructure from the physical layer up. She had not replaced Richard Calloway. She had restructured the role instead, distributing its functions across 3 people with overlapping visibility into each other's work, because she had concluded that concentrated operational trust without structural check was a design flaw she wasn't going to replicate. There were days when she still felt the residue of it, the specific alertness that develops in someone who has been deceived for a long time, the tendency to look for the wrong thing in the right people. She was working on this. It was not going well, and then it was going better, and then it was not going well again. That was the actual texture of it, and she had stopped expecting it to be otherwise. "She's doing the thing," Grant said quietly. Vivian looked down. Maisie had produced a small notebook from her coat pocket, a composition notebook, the same kind Grant used, because Maisie had claimed one from his supply approximately 6 months ago and had been filling it since with drawings and observations and detailed plans for her eventual career in marine biology and building design, and was sketching something, crouched down, using her knee as a desk. "What's she drawing?" Vivian asked. "Probably the building," Grant said. She's been working on her own version for 2 months. It has more squid-related motifs than the current design, which I've told her is a legitimate artistic choice that the community board may not share. She told me last week that the signage on the front should have a wave pattern, Vivian said, because the neighborhood is near the water and people should be reminded of that. Grant looked at her. She told you that? We had a conversation about it. She had drawn 3 options. Vivian paused. I think the wave pattern is actually a good idea. He was quiet for a moment, looking at Maisie and her notebook. Something in his face did what it did sometimes. The particular shift that Vivian had learned to recognize over the past year as the specific expression of a man feeling something larger than he was going to comment on directly. It lasted a few seconds, and then he looked at the lot, and it settled back into his ordinary face, which was a good face, worn in the specific way that faces get worn by things that matter. This was something she had come to understand about Grant Holloway over the past 14 months. He was not a man who expressed things in the register that most people expected feeling to arrive in. He didn't narrate his inner life or announce his attachments or say the things that people said when they were trying to make sure you understood how they felt. He showed up. He fixed what could be fixed. He stood next to you at the edge of a frozen lot in February and handed you a coffee and looked at the ground where something was going to be built. She had spent a long time building things in ways that were designed to be impressive from the outside. She had built for the photograph, for the visible achievement, for the version of success that required external confirmation to feel real. It had produced something substantial and something hollow at the same time, which was a particular kind of architectural failure. The building that photographs beautifully and functions poorly. She didn't know yet exactly what she was building now, with the reconfigured company and the Bronx project, and the Tuesday evenings in the restaurant, and the Saturday mornings in the park, and the 7-year-old who had decided, without making it a production, to include her in the ordinary ongoing project of her life. She didn't know if it would hold. She had learned not to be too certain about what held and what didn't. But she knew this. The people standing beside her on this frozen lot on this February morning were real in the specific way that things are real when they have cost something. They had not been easy to come by, and they had not arrived in the form she would have designed if she'd been designing for the photograph. Maisie had a squid on her hat and was drawing a community center with wave pattern signage in a composition notebook on her knee. Grant was drinking bad coffee with the focused calm of a man who had learned, through necessary practice, to be present in the moment he was actually in. The thing about people who have lost something significant, Vivian had come to understand, was not that they were broken. It was that they had learned something about the structural load that human beings were actually capable of carrying, something that people who had not yet lost anything tended not to know yet. Grant had been carrying Maisie and carrying his grief and carrying the memory of a life he'd planned to have and hadn't, and he'd been doing it while fixing other people's buildings and reading ocean books at bedtime and showing up at a gala in a 10-year-old suit because his 6-year-old had asked him what fancy parties looked like from the inside. She had invited him to her table as a joke, as a novelty, as the kind of impulsive gesture that Gerald Frost would have disapproved of, and that had turned out to be the most structurally significant decision she'd made in a year, full of significant decisions. People had laughed at him in that ballroom. She remembered the sound of it. She remembered registering it and watching him not react, and wondering what kind of person didn't react to being laughed at in a room full of people who had decided he didn't belong. The kind of person, it turned out, who had already decided that belonging wasn't contingent on whether the room approved of him. The kind of person who'd made that decision not out of arrogance but out of necessity, out of 4 years of being the only thing standing between a small girl and a world that wasn't always organized around her well-being. The kind of person who looked at a painting everyone else had walked past and saw the thing that was off. Who looked at maintenance records and found a conspiracy. Who looked at a frozen lot in the South Bronx and saw a reading room with north-facing windows and a kitchen that got morning light and an afternoon room where children could figure out what they wanted to be. Maisie looked up from her notebook. She looked at the lot, then at Grant, then at Vivian. "It's going to be good," she said, with the same certainty she'd used when she said Grant would build it right. Not hope, not optimism, just a 6-year-old's direct assessment of available information. When it's done, it's going to be really good. Grant looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Grant. "Yeah," Grant said, "it is." They stood at the edge of the lot in the February cold, the 3 of them, looking at the frozen ground where something was going to be built. Not perfect, not a photograph. Just a building on a street that needed one, made by people who understood that the measure of a structure was never how it looked from outside, but whether the people inside it could see clearly and breathe and stay. The wind came off the river and Maisie pulled her hat down over her ears, the squid on top tilting sideways with the adjustment, and went back to her drawing, and the February light fell across the frozen lot at the particular angle that told Grant, as soon as he saw it, exactly where the reading room windows needed to go.